The smoke rose long before the cries reached the hills. At first it drifted lazily above the rooftops of the Saxon village, blending with the morning mist that clung to the fields. Then came the sound that every family dreaded, the deep blast of a war horn rolling across the river like distant thunder. Within moments, peaceful routines shattered into panic. Farmers abandoned their plows. Mothers seized frightened children. Old men grasped hunting spears that had little chance against hardened warriors. Downstream, sleek, dragon-prowed ships slid silently through the water, their carved heads glaring toward the shore. The Vikings had returned. They came with axes polished from years of battle, round shields painted in bold colors, and the confidence of men who expected victory. Doors splintered beneath heavy blows. Thatched roofs burst into flames. Livestock scattered into the countryside, while terrified villagers fled toward nearby woods, hoping the forest might hide them from merciless pursuers. Some escaped, many did not. Before sunset, another settlement had vanished from the map of England, leaving behind only ashes, broken timber, and grieving survivors who wondered whether anyone possessed the power to restore peace. Across the fractured kingdoms of 9th century Britain, scenes like this unfolded again and again. Fear ruled where kings struggled to govern, revenge often replaced justice, and ordinary people lived under the constant shadow of violence. In this harsh world, law depended less upon written principles than upon local customs, the authority of powerful lords, and the willingness of families to defend their own honor. Yet from this age of uncertainty emerged a ruler whose greatest achievement would not simply be defeating invading armies. His lasting triumph would be transforming the very meaning of justice. That ruler was Alfred of Wessex, remembered through history as Alfred the Great, the king who began laying the legal foundations upon which England itself would eventually stand. To understand why Alfred's achievements became so extraordinary, it is necessary to return to an England that barely resembled the unified nation recognized today. In the 9th century, there was no single kingdom called England. Instead, the island was divided among several Anglo-Saxon realms whose rulers frequently competed against one another, even while facing dangers from beyond the sea. Northumbria stretched across much of the north. Mercia dominated the Midlands. East Anglia occupied fertile lands toward the east. Kent retained its ancient traditions in the southeast, while Wessex controlled the southern and southwestern regions. Each kingdom possessed its own royal family, its own nobles, its own customs, and often its own interpretations of justice. Loyalty centered upon kinship, local rulers, and regional identity rather than upon a united English nation. This political fragmentation created both opportunity and vulnerability. During times of peace, individual kingdoms developed prosperous farming communities, monasteries, trading centers, and networks of local administration. Yet when powerful enemies arrived, cooperation between rival kings often proved slow, uncertain, or entirely absent. Alliances shifted according to immediate necessity rather than long-term strategy. One kingdom might negotiate with invaders, while another continued fighting. Some rulers sought advantage over neighboring kingdoms instead of confronting common threats together. Such divisions would soon prove disastrous. The people who inhabited these kingdoms descended largely from Germanic settlers, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who had established themselves in Britain centuries earlier following the decline of Roman authority. Over generations, they developed sophisticated societies rooted in agriculture, Christianity, and regional kingship. Villages formed the heart of everyday life. Most people spent their days cultivating grain, raising livestock, repairing fences, and preparing for harsh winters. Wealth depended heavily upon land, and land itself determined social standing. Noble families owned extensive estates worked by tenants and laborers, while free farmers enjoyed rights unavailable to those bound by servitude. Monasteries served not only as religious centers, but also as places where books were copied, learning preserved, and records maintained. Churches offered spiritual, even sacred buildings, increasingly became targets for raiders. Justice within these communities reflected traditions passed down over generations, rather than a single national legal system. Law existed, but it varied considerably from one kingdom to another. Earlier rulers had issued collections of legal judgments, often called dooms, establishing penalties for crimes ranging from theft to assault. These laws recognized compensation as a preferred alternative to endless cycles of revenge. A man who injured another might owe financial payment rather than provoking generations of bloodshed between families. Yet such principles depended heavily upon local enforcement. The basic structure of justice rested upon a community participation. Local assemblies, sometimes known as moots, gathered free men to settle disputes, witness agreements, and determine responsibility in legal conflicts. Oaths carried immense significance. Swearing falsely before God endangered not only one's reputation, but also one's soul. Witnesses played essential roles because written records remained relatively uncommon. Honor and credibility often mattered as much as physical evidence. At the center of many legal disputes stood the concept of compensation, commonly measured according to a person's social rank. Every individual possessed a value in the eyes of the law. If someone were killed unlawfully, the offender, or more often the offender's family, could pay compensation to the victim's relatives. The amount varied according to status. A noble commanded a higher compensation than a common freeman, while enslaved individuals possessed fewer legal protections. Though modern observers may find such distinctions troubling, these payments represented an attempt to restrain private vengeance and preserve social stability in societies where centralized policing scarcely existed. Even so, justice remained uneven. Powerful nobles could influence outcomes through wealth, connections, or intimidation. Poorer individuals sometimes struggled to secure fair hearings. Kings theoretically upheld peace throughout their realms, but their authority weakened with distance from royal courts. Remote villages relied primarily upon local leaders whose judgments reflected regional customs as much as royal expectations. These challenges became even more severe as external threats intensified. For generations, seaborne raiders from Scandinavia had occasionally struck monasteries and coastal settlements before disappearing with plunder. Early attacks shocked Christian Europe because monasteries appeared especially vulnerable. The famous assault upon Lindisfarne in 793 became remembered as a terrifying symbol of a new age of violence. Yet these early raids generally remained seasonal. Viking crews arrived swiftly, seized treasure, and departed before substantial resistance could gather. During the 9th century, however, the nature of Viking warfare changed dramatically. Instead of launching isolated raids, Scandinavian leaders increasingly organized large armies capable of conquering and occupying territory. These forces included experienced warriors from Denmark and other parts of Scandinavia, who sought not merely wealth, but land, political influence, and permanent settlement. Their mobility, battlefield skill, and willingness to campaign throughout the year made them formidable opponents. In 865, one of the most consequential military expeditions in British history landed upon English shores. Later chroniclers referred to it as the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiding parties, this coalition intended sustained conquest. It marched inland, capturing towns, defeating kings, and exploiting rivalries among Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One by one, established realms began collapsing beneath relentless pressure. Northumbria fell first into chaos. Civil conflict among its rulers weakened resistance, allowing Viking leaders to seize York, one of the kingdom's most important cities. East Anglia suffered next, its king ultimately killed after resisting invasion. Mercia struggled desperately, but gradually lost control over much of its territory. With each victory, Scandinavian influence expanded further across England. For ordinary people, these campaigns transformed daily existence into a constant struggle for survival. Harvests were interrupted by warfare, villages abandoned fertile lands to escape advancing armies, livestock disappeared into the hands of conquerors. Markets ceased functioning as roads became dangerous. Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves refugees, carrying whatever possessions they could transport while searching for safer settlements. Economic disruption spread almost as rapidly as military defeat. Fields left uncultivated produced poor harvests. Trade declined. Monasteries that once preserved learning and provided charity suffered destruction or abandonment. Taxes became more difficult to collect as royal authority weakened. Communities already burdened by uncertainty faced additional hardship from famine and displacement. Fear also undermined trust within society itself. Travelers suspected strangers. Local leaders worried about collaborators assisting invading forces. Some communities negotiated peacefully with Viking commanders, hoping to avoid destruction. Others resisted and paid terrible prices. Decisions made under extreme pressure often divided neighbors long after armies departed. Maintaining justice during such turmoil became extraordinarily difficult. Courts required stability. Laws depended upon recognized authority. Compensation for crimes assumed that communities possessed both resources and confidence in legal institutions. Continuous warfare shattered these assumptions. If villages disappeared, witnesses died, and local officials fled, who remained to enforce judgments? If kings lost control over territories, whose laws still applied? Violence threatened not merely individual lives, but the entire framework upon which orderly government rested. Among all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms confronting this crisis, only Wessex continued resisting with determination and growing effectiveness. Its rulers recognized that survival required more than courage on the battlefield. They needed resilient leadership, capable of preserving political institutions even during military emergencies. Wessex possessed advantages, including defensible geography, experienced noble families, and a royal dynasty determined to continue fighting despite repeated setbacks. Nevertheless, victory remained far from certain. Viking armies repeatedly invaded Wessex, testing its defenses and exhausting its resources. Every campaign risked becoming the one that finally destroyed the last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Many contemporaries likely believed complete conquest inevitable. It was within this desperate struggle that a young prince named Alfred gradually emerged. He had not been born expecting to reshape English history. Several older brothers stood ahead of him in the royal succession, and few could have predicted that circumstances would eventually place the kingdom upon his shoulders. Yet even before wearing a crown, Alfred displayed qualities unusual among warrior princes. He valued learning as deeply as military strength. He admired wisdom alongside courage. He believed that rulers bore responsibilities extending beyond victory in battle. The England Alfred inherited stood upon the edge of collapse. Enemies threatened from without, wild disorder weakened society from within. Villages burned, kingdoms disappeared, and confidence in lasting peace seemed almost impossible to imagine. Yet, amid destruction, Alfred began envisioning something greater than survival. He sought a kingdom where justice would no longer depend solely upon the strength of individual lords or the vengeance of grieving families, but upon laws respected throughout the realm. That vision would require years of sacrifice, military endurance, political reform, and intellectual determination. Before Alfred could become history's great lawgiver, however, he first had to become the leader capable of saving Wessex itself. In the life of this remarkable king, the sword would defend the kingdom, but the law would ultimately define it. The making of Alfred the Great. Long before Alfred became the defender of Wessex or the architect of one of medieval England's most influential law codes, he was a younger son who seemed unlikely ever to wear a crown. Born around the year 849 at the royal estate of Wantage in Berkshire, Alfred entered a kingdom already burdened by uncertainty. His father, King Ethelwulf of Wessex, ruled one of the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, yet even he could not ignore the growing threat from across the North Sea. Viking raids had become more frequent. Monasteries along the coast fortified what they could, and every royal council included discussions about defense. No one knew that the youngest prince would one day carry the fate of England itself. Alfred was the fifth and youngest surviving son of King Ethelwulf and his first wife, Osburh, a woman remembered by later writers as intelligent, deeply religious, and descended from a respected noble family. His older brothers, Ethelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, stood before him in the line of succession. Under ordinary circumstances, Alfred's future would likely have involved assisting his brothers, governing estates, commanding armies, or serving as an advisor to the royal court. Few could have imagined that nearly every older brother would die before him, leaving the kingdom to the youngest son. Unlike many medieval princes, whose childhoods remain almost entirely hidden from history, Alfred's early years are illuminated by one remarkable source. Near the end of Alfred's reign, the Welsh monk Asser composed a biography of the king, providing rare insight into his education, character, and ambitions. Although modern historians debate some details, Asser's account paints the picture of a curious and unusually thoughtful child whose interests extended far beyond hunting and warfare. One famous story illustrates this perfectly. Alfred's mother possessed a beautifully illuminated book of Old English poetry. Its pages were decorated with colorful illustrations and elegant lettering, making it one of the family's most treasured possessions. Gathering her sons around her, she promised that whoever learned the book first would receive it as a gift. While his older brothers hesitated or assumed they had plenty of time, young Alfred immediately accepted the challenge. Though he had not yet mastered reading, he memorized the poems with the help of tutors and returned to claim the prize. Whether every detail of the story is literally true matters less than what it reveals about Alfred's reputation. Even during his own lifetime, he was remembered as someone driven by an extraordinary hunger for knowledge. In an age when kings were expected above all to lead warriors into battle, Alfred became known equally for his devotion to books, learning, and wisdom. His education reflected both royal privilege and the limitations of 9th century England. Formal schools scarcely existed outside monasteries and cathedral communities. Most noble children learned through private tutors, members of the clergy, and practical experience within the royal household. Alfred studied Christian scripture, religious teachings, history, genealogy, poetry, and the traditions of his ancestors. He listened carefully to stories of earlier kings, not merely as entertainment, but as lessons in leadership. Yet one irony followed him throughout much of his youth. Although Alfred loved books passionately, he appears to have learned to read Latin only later in life. Latin remained the language of scholarship, law, diplomacy, and the church across Western Europe. Most ordinary people spoke Old English, but important religious and intellectual works existed primarily in Latin. Alfred often listened as scholars read aloud, committing vast amounts of information to memory before eventually mastering the language himself as an adult. This distinction shaped his thinking profoundly. He understood firsthand how inaccessible knowledge had become. If even a prince struggled to obtain education, what hope existed for ordinary clergy, officials, or judges responsible for governing the kingdom? Years later, this realization would inspire one of the greatest educational reform programs in Anglo-Saxon history. Alfred's childhood also introduced him to the wider Christian world beyond England. Around the age of 4 or 5, he accompanied his father on a remarkable journey to Rome. For any Anglo-Saxon child, such a pilgrimage represented an extraordinary experience. The journey itself stretched across mountains, rivers, forests, and foreign kingdoms before finally reaching the ancient capital of Western Christianity. Rome in the mid-9th century retained immense symbolic importance despite the decline of the old Roman Empire. Magnificent churches stood upon foundations laid centuries earlier. Pilgrims from across Europe crowded its streets. The authority of the Pope connected distant Christian kingdoms through shared faith, ceremony, and tradition. According to contemporary accounts, Pope Leo IV welcomed the young prince warmly and bestowed special blessings upon him. Later writers even suggested that Alfred underwent a ceremonial anointing, though historians continue debating the precise nature of the event. Whatever actually occurred, the visit undoubtedly impressed the young boy. He witnessed institutions that had endured for centuries, preserving learning and religious authority through times of political upheaval. The contrast with England could hardly have been greater. While Rome embodied continuity and inherited wisdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained politically fragmented, vulnerable to invasion, and divided by regional rivalries. Alfred never forgot these differences. The return journey exposed him further to continental Europe, where he observed different customs, methods of government, and approaches to administration. Though still a child, he began understanding that kingdoms could be organized in many different ways. Leadership involved more than courage on the battlefield. It required institutions capable of surviving individual rulers. Back in Wessex, Alfred's adolescence unfolded amid mounting military danger. Viking raids intensified throughout southern England. Royal councils increasingly focused upon defense rather than diplomacy. Noble families strengthened local fortifications, while kings coordinated armies to respond rapidly whenever enemy fleets appeared along the coast. Like every prince of his generation, Alfred received military training from an early age. He learned to ride horses over difficult terrain, wield sword and spear, command warriors, and understand battlefield tactics. Anglo-Saxon warfare demanded physical endurance as much as technical skill. Campaigns often required long marches carrying heavy equipment across forests, rivers, and marshland before engaging disciplined opponents. Yet Alfred never viewed warfare as an end in itself. Even while mastering military arts, he continued seeking knowledge from priests, scholars, and experienced counselors. This unusual balance between intellectual curiosity and martial discipline distinguished him from many contemporary rulers. He believed wisdom strengthened courage rather than weakening it. The royal household itself served as Alfred's greatest classroom. There he observed his father's government confronting diplomatic negotiations, military planning, judicial disputes, and religious responsibilities. Kingship appeared neither glamorous nor easy. Every decision carried consequences affecting thousands of lives. When King Ethelwulf died in 858, the orderly succession demonstrated one strength of the West Saxon dynasty. Alfred's older brothers assumed the throne one after another according to age and circumstance. Ethelbald ruled first, followed by Ethelbert, then Ethelred. Throughout these transitions, Alfred gained increasing experience supporting royal government without expecting ever to become king himself. During the reign of King Ethelred, Alfred emerged as one of Wessex's most important military leaders. The kingdom now faced repeated invasions from the great heathen army, whose victories elsewhere had already destroyed Northumbria and East Anglia, while crippling Mercia. Wessex stood increasingly alone. In 871, historians sometimes call the Year of Battles. Alfred and his brother fought a series of desperate engagements against Viking armies. Within only a few months, West Saxon forces marched repeatedly to confront experienced Scandinavian commanders across Berkshire and neighboring regions. At the Battle of Ashdown, Alfred displayed remarkable courage. Although still only a prince, he reportedly assumed command of part of the army when circumstances demanded immediate action. Facing fierce Viking assaults, the West Saxons launched a determined counterattack that ended in one of their most significant victories. The triumph proved that Viking armies were not invincible, but success came at enormous cost. Other battles ended less favorably. Casualties mounted, resources dwindled. The kingdom's leaders found themselves trapped in an exhausting cycle of raising armies, fighting engagements, negotiating temporary truces, and preparing for renewed invasions. Then tragedy struck the royal family once again. King Ethelred died in April 871, probably from illness, compounded by the relentless pressures of war. His sons were still young children, incapable of leading armies during the greatest crisis Wessex had ever faced. Under Anglo-Saxon custom and political necessity, the crown passed not to a child, but to Alfred. At approximately 22 years of age, Alfred suddenly became king. He inherited neither peace nor prosperity. Instead, he received a kingdom under constant military attack. Exhausted by continuous warfare, surrounded by fallen neighbors, and facing enemies whose victories had convinced many that complete conquest remained only a matter of time, few rulers had begun their reign under more desperate circumstances. Almost immediately, Alfred confronted impossible choices. His treasury had been drained by years of campaigning. His armies required rebuilding. Farmers needed protection to harvest crops essential for survival. Churches demanded restoration after repeated attacks. Nobles expected decisive leadership despite uncertain prospects. On several occasions, Alfred negotiated temporary peace agreements with Viking commanders, paying tribute in exchange for precious time to reorganize his kingdom. Modern readers sometimes interpret such payments as weakness, but they reflected practical realism. A defeated kingdom could not reform itself. Survival had to come first. Throughout these early struggles, Alfred's vision gradually expanded beyond immediate military concerns. He recognized that even if Viking armies could eventually be defeated, England's deeper problems would remain unresolved. Why had the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fallen one after another? Why had cooperation proved so difficult? Why had justice weakened whenever royal authority declined? Why had learning deteriorated until even many priests struggled to read Latin texts? Military victory alone could not answer these questions. Alfred increasingly believed that a stronger kingdom required stronger institutions. Laws needed consistency. Judges required education. Officials demanded accountability. Ordinary people deserved confidence that justice would survive even during times of crisis. His experiences as a younger prince shaped these convictions. He had witnessed the grandeur of Rome, where institutions outlasted individual rulers. He had studied earlier Anglo-Saxon law codes that attempted to preserve order through written principles, rather than personal vengeance. He had observed how ignorance weakened government and how education strengthened leadership. Most importantly, he had learned that courage without wisdom could win battles but rarely secure lasting peace. The young king, therefore, carried into the darkest years of his reign an ambition unlike that of many medieval rulers. He sought not merely to defend territory, but to rebuild society itself. He envisioned a kingdom where military strength protected justice, education, supported good government, and law united people who had too often been divided by local custom and endless conflict. Before Alfred could pursue those sweeping reforms, however, he would face the greatest trial of his life. The Viking armies were preparing another massive offensive, one that would drive the King of Wessex into hiding, push his kingdom to the brink of extinction, and force him to prove whether his vision for England could survive its darkest hour. Fighting for the survival of England. When Alfred became king in 871, he inherited a throne surrounded by ruin. Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia had been conquered. Much of Mercia lay under Viking domination. Wessex stood as the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still resisting the great heathen army. Every victory won by Alfred's enemies increased the pressure on his young reign, and every defeat suffered by neighboring kingdoms served as a warning of what awaited Wessex if it failed. For several years, Alfred fought a desperate defensive war. Viking armies moved rapidly across southern England, striking towns, seizing supplies, and forcing the West Saxons to respond again and again. The king gathered local militias, summoned noble retainers, and marched wherever the threat appeared greatest. Sometimes he won. Sometimes he was forced to negotiate. More than once he paid tribute to buy precious time for his exhausted kingdom. The Vikings understood that Wessex was the final obstacle to their complete dominance of Anglo-Saxon England. Their leaders were not merely raiders seeking quick plunder. They were experienced commanders building a new political order. Each campaign tested Alfred's resources and his authority. By the mid-870s, the struggle had become increasingly dangerous. Viking forces established winter bases, allowing them to remain in England year-round rather than returning to Scandinavia after seasonal raids. This gave them greater mobility and made surprise attacks far more difficult to predict. Then, in early 878, disaster struck. During the Christian feast of Epiphany, when many believed military operations were unlikely, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a sudden assault on the royal stronghold at Chippenham. The attack caught the West Saxons largely unprepared. Alfred escaped, but much of his kingdom fell into enemy hands. Some nobles submitted, others fled. For a brief moment, it seemed that Wessex itself might collapse just as the other kingdoms had done. Alfred's situation became desperate. With only a small band of loyal followers, he retreated into the marshes of Somerset, a region of wetlands, rivers, reeds, and hidden waterways that offered natural protection from pursuit. Later generations would remember this period through legend, including the famous story of Alfred burning a peasant woman's cakes while distracted by thoughts of his kingdom. Whether the tale is true or not, it captures an important reality. The king, who would later be called the Great, spent part of his reign as a fugitive hiding in the marshes. Yet the retreat was not surrender. From his refuge at Athelney, Alfred began rebuilding resistance. Messengers traveled secretly across Wessex, carrying word that the king still lived. Loyal nobles gathered men, farmers concealed weapons. Communities that had not yet submitted waited for a chance to rise again. The marshes became the center of a remarkable recovery. Alfred studied the enemy's movements, planned carefully, and prepared for a counterattack. He understood that one reckless battle could destroy the last hope of Anglo-Saxon independence. Patience became as important as courage. In the spring of 878, the moment finally arrived. Alfred emerged from the marshes and summoned the fighting men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to meet him at a place called Egbert's Stone. The response was extraordinary. Warriors who had endured months of occupation and uncertainty gathered around their king. The sight of Alfred alive and ready to fight restored confidence throughout Wessex. From Egbert's Stone, the army marched toward Guthrum's forces. The two sides met near Edington in what would become one of the decisive battles in English history. The fighting was fierce. Viking warriors formed their shield wall, a dense barrier of overlapping shields designed to absorb enemy attacks. The West Saxons advanced against it in brutal close combat. Spears thrust over shield rims. Axes crashed against wood and iron. Men struggled shoulder to shoulder in a contest of endurance and discipline. According to contemporary accounts, Alfred's army fought with exceptional determination. These were not merely soldiers defending territory. They were fighting for the survival of their kingdom, their families, and their way of life. After prolonged combat, the Viking line broke. Guthrum's forces retreated to a nearby fortress, where Alfred surrounded them and cut off supplies. After weeks of siege, Guthrum surrendered. The victory at Edington transformed the political future of England. For the first time in years, a major Viking army had been decisively defeated by an Anglo-Saxon king. Alfred had not only survived, he had reversed what seemed an inevitable conquest. The settlement that followed became known as the Treaty of Wedmore. Its exact terms remained partly uncertain, but the agreement established a framework for peace between Alfred and Guthrum. Most symbolically, Guthrum accepted baptism as a Christian, with Alfred serving as his sponsor. The Viking leader adopted the Christian name Ethelstan, a gesture intended to signal a new relationship between the two rulers. The treaty also recognized territorial boundaries. Guthrum and his followers withdrew from Wessex and settled in eastern England, while Alfred retained control of his kingdom. This arrangement did not end all Viking activity, but it created a more stable frontier and gave Wessex the breathing space it desperately needed. Many kings would have considered the victory complete. Alfred did not. As he surveyed the damage left by years of invasion, he recognized a deeper problem. Armies could defeat enemies in battle, but military success alone could not rebuild a shattered society. Villages had been destroyed, trade had been disrupted, monasteries had been abandoned, local government had weakened. In many areas, the ordinary mechanisms of justice barely functioned. A kingdom exhausted by war needed more than fortifications and soldiers. It needed laws that people trusted, courts that operated fairly, officials who could enforce judgments, and a ruler committed to protecting the weak as well as the powerful. Alfred had learned harsh lessons during his years of struggle. He had seen how quickly order collapsed when authority disappeared. He had witnessed communities torn apart by fear, displacement, and violence. He had relied on the loyalty of ordinary people who believed their king still represented something worth defending. Those experiences shaped his vision for the future. The victory over Guthrum gave Alfred an opportunity that few rulers receive, the chance to rebuild a kingdom after surviving near destruction. Instead of restoring the old system exactly as it had existed before the invasions, he began planning something more ambitious. He wanted stronger defenses, better administration, improved education, and a more consistent system of justice throughout Wessex. In the years that followed, Alfred reorganized military service, constructed fortified towns, encouraged learning, and strengthened royal government. But among all these reforms, one would prove especially significant for the future of England. He decided to create a comprehensive law code. Drawing upon earlier Anglo-Saxon traditions, Christian teachings, and his own understanding of justice, Alfred set out to establish clearer principles for governing his kingdom. The result would become known as the Doom Book, a collection of laws that sought not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to create a more orderly and unified society. His greatest victory, Alfred increasingly realized, would not be measured only by the battlefield of Edington. It would be measured by whether the people of Wessex could live under laws stronger than fear, stronger than revenge, and strong enough to survive long after the Viking armies had passed. The sword had saved the kingdom. Now, Alfred turned to the harder task of teaching the kingdom how to live in peace. The birth of England's first great law code. The victory at Edington saved Wessex, but Alfred knew that battles alone could never secure the future of his kingdom. Burned villages could be rebuilt, crops could be replanted, fortifications could be strengthened. Yet the deepest wounds left by decades of war were less visible. Trust had been broken. Local government had weakened. Courts had ceased to function in many places. Communities that had once settled disputes through established customs now struggled beneath the weight of uncertainty. In some regions, revenge had again become easier than justice. Alfred understood that if England were to endure, it would need something stronger than victorious armies. It would need laws that commanded respect throughout the kingdom. For many rulers, issuing laws served primarily to demonstrate royal authority. Alfred viewed legislation differently. He believed that a king stood accountable before God for the justice practiced within his realm. A ruler who failed to protect the innocent, punish wrongdoing fairly, or govern with wisdom endangered not only his kingdom but also his own soul. His experiences during the Viking Wars had convinced him that military strength without moral order could preserve a kingdom only temporarily. Lasting peace required justice that ordinary people trusted. The years following Edington therefore marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable intellectual projects undertaken by any medieval king. Alfred did not simply gather advisors and dictate new rules. Instead, he began studying the legal traditions inherited from earlier generations. He wanted to understand how previous kings had governed, which customs had preserved peace, and where reforms had become necessary. This approach reflected Alfred's respect for history. Unlike rulers who sought fame through sweeping innovation, he believed that wisdom often lay in preserving what earlier generations had already proven effective. His task was not to erase the past, but to strengthen it. By Alfred's reign, Anglo-Saxon England already possessed centuries of legal tradition. Some of the earliest surviving English law codes had been written nearly 300 years before his birth. Around the beginning of the 7th century, King Ethelbert of Kent had issued what historians recognize as the earliest known written laws in any Germanic language. These laws established detailed scales of compensation for injuries and offenses, reflecting a society where preventing blood feuds remained one of government's greatest concerns. Other rulers had followed similar paths. Kings such as Ine of Wessex, Offa of Mercia, and various Kentish monarchs issued their own collections of laws to address local conditions. Each kingdom developed slightly different customs, reflecting regional traditions and political circumstances. Although many principles overlapped, no single legal code governed all Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred carefully examined these earlier collections. Among them, the laws of King Ine held particular importance. Ine had ruled Wessex during the late 7th and early 8th centuries, more than a century before Alfred's birth. His legal code addressed issues, ranging from land ownership and theft to military obligations and agricultural responsibilities. Since Alfred ruled the same kingdom, Ine's laws remained especially relevant. Rather than discarding Ine's work, Alfred openly acknowledged his debt to it. He admired earlier kings who had sought justice through careful legislation rather than arbitrary commands. In doing so, Alfred revealed an unusually humble attitude for a medieval monarch. He presented himself not as the inventor of English law, but as its guardian and reformer. Yet Alfred also recognized that his own age faced challenges unknown to earlier rulers. Viking invasions had transformed the political landscape. Communities had been uprooted. Property disputes multiplied as farms changed hands during years of conflict. Churches required protection after repeated attacks. Royal authority needed strengthening if peace were to survive. Existing laws provided valuable foundations, but they required adaptation to new realities. The legal collection Alfred eventually produced became known in later centuries as the Doom Book. In modern English, the word doom often suggests catastrophe or destruction, but its original Old English meaning differed entirely. A doom simply meant a judgment, decree, or legal decision. Alfred's Doom Book therefore represented a compilation of judgments intended to guide courts, officials, and communities throughout his kingdom. The code was far more than a list of punishments. It reflected Alfred's understanding of justice itself. One of its most striking features appears at the very beginning. Instead of opening immediately with royal commands, Alfred chose to begin with passages drawn from the Bible. He included portions of the Ten Commandments, followed by sections from the Book of Exodus that described laws given to the Israelites. He also referred to Christian teachings emphasizing mercy, fairness, and moral responsibility. To modern readers, beginning a legal code with biblical scripture may seem unusual. In Alfred's world, however, it carried profound significance. Christianity had become deeply rooted within Anglo-Saxon society by the 9th century. Kings ruled not merely through military power, but as Christian monarchs expected to uphold divine justice. Alfred believed that human law should reflect eternal moral principles established by God. Earthly rulers could make judgments, but those judgments ought to remain consistent with higher standards of righteousness. His introduction carefully explained this philosophy. Alfred described how earlier biblical laws had been fulfilled through the teachings of Christ, emphasizing justice tempered by mercy rather than blind vengeance. He did not argue that every ancient Israelite law should apply directly to Wessex. Instead, he sought universal principles capable of guiding Christian government. This approach distinguished Alfred from many contemporary rulers. He viewed legislation as a moral responsibility rather than merely an administrative necessity. Law existed not simply to maintain order, but to encourage virtuous conduct and protect human dignity. Equally important was Alfred's insistence that kings themselves remained subject to justice. Although medieval monarchs possessed immense authority, Alfred repeatedly emphasized that rulers must judge honestly and avoid favoritism. Power carried obligations. A king who governed unjustly betrayed both his people and God. His concern for impartial judgment likely reflected painful lessons learned during years of warfare. Alfred had witnessed societies collapsing when authority weakened or became corrupt. Local officials sometimes favored powerful families. Wealth influenced outcomes. Personal loyalties interfered with fair decisions. Alfred sought to strengthen confidence in legal institutions by reminding judges that they serve justice rather than private interests. Throughout the code, Alfred frequently preserved earlier laws instead of replacing them. Where previous kings had established sound principles, he retained them. Where clarification became necessary, he revised carefully. Occasionally, he omitted provisions that no longer suited contemporary circumstances. This method demonstrated remarkable restraint. In one famous passage, Alfred admitted that he had not dared include every earlier law, unchanged, because he could not be certain future generations would approve all of them. Instead, he selected those provisions he considered most just after consulting trusted advisors. Such honesty remains unusual in medieval legislation. Rather than claiming perfect wisdom, Alfred acknowledged the limits of his own judgment. Consultation itself became an essential part of the process. Alfred did not work alone. Bishops, experienced nobles, legal experts, and royal counselors contributed their knowledge. Clergymen helped interpret biblical teachings. Noblemen understood practical challenges facing local administration. Judges shared experience from resolving disputes across the kingdom. The resulting code reflected collaboration between royal authority and accumulated tradition. This balance between continuity and reform became one of Alfred's greatest achievements. Radical change often provokes resistance, especially in societies deeply attached to inherited customs. Alfred avoided unnecessary conflict by showing respect for established traditions while gradually strengthening royal justice. His broader vision also extended beyond individual legal cases. Alfred increasingly viewed law as a force capable of unifying diverse communities within Wessex. Villages separated by many miles might maintain different customs, dialects, and local identities. Yet, if they recognized common legal principles upheld by the king, they could begin thinking of themselves as belonging to the same political community. This idea would prove revolutionary over time. Before Alfred, most Anglo-Saxons identified first with their local region, family, or kingdom. The concept of a unified England remained distant. By promoting shared standards of justice across Wessex, Alfred laid important groundwork for broader political unity. Law became one of the invisible bonds connecting people who might never meet one another, but nevertheless lived under the same royal protection. The king also understood that written law possessed advantages over unwritten custom. Oral traditions could vary from village to village. If memories faded, disputes arose over exactly what earlier judgments required. Recording laws created greater consistency and allowed officials to consult authoritative texts when difficult questions emerged. Yet Alfred never intended written law to replace wisdom. Judges still needed experience, integrity, and compassion. Legal codes provided guidance, but justice required thoughtful application rather than mechanical obedience. The spirit of the law mattered as much as its precise wording. As Alfred continued shaping his great code, his attention increasingly turned toward those most vulnerable within society. War had produced countless widows, orphaned children, displaced families, and impoverished farmers struggling to rebuild their lives. A truly just kingdom, Alfred believed, could not measure success solely by protecting the wealthy or powerful. Its laws must also defend those least able to defend themselves. That conviction would become one of the defining features of his legislation. In the next stage of his reforms, Alfred would address property rights, compensation for crimes, judicial responsibility, and the protection of the weak, creating a legal vision whose influence would extend far beyond his own lifetime and help shape the future course of English justice. The birth of England's first great law code. As Alfred continued shaping what would become his great law code, he never lost sight of the people whose lives would be affected by every judgment. A law written only for kings and nobles could never bring lasting peace to a kingdom recovering from decades of war. If justice was to restore Wessex, it had to reach every level of society, from wealthy landowners and bishops to village farmers, craftsmen, widows, and laborers, whose voices were seldom heard in royal councils. For Alfred, law existed not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to preserve peace. Every dispute left unresolved carried the risk of violence. Every unfair judgment weakened confidence in royal authority. Every abuse of power encouraged ordinary people to seek justice through revenge rather than through the courts. The king understood that rebuilding trust in legal institutions would be one of the greatest challenges of his reign. One of the most important principles within Alfred's code was the protection of those least able to defend themselves. Medieval society was deeply unequal, and no 9th century ruler believed all people possessed identical legal status. Nobles enjoyed privileges unavailable to common freemen, while enslaved individuals occupied the lowest position within the social hierarchy. Yet Alfred repeatedly emphasized that weakness should never become an invitation to exploitation. Widows received particular attention. Years of warfare had left countless women without husbands. Many suddenly found themselves responsible for managing farms, raising children, and defending family property against ambitious neighbors. Without legal protection, widows could easily lose land through intimidation or fraudulent claims. Alfred insisted that such women deserved the protection of the law. Their property rights had to be respected. Agreements concerning inheritance required careful enforcement. Those who attempted to seize land unlawfully threatened not only individual families, but also the stability of the kingdom itself. Orphans, likewise, occupied a special place in Alfred's concern. Children who had lost their parents possessed little ability to defend inherited rights. Guardians therefore carried serious responsibilities. A guardian who abused his position or stole property entrusted to his care violated both legal and moral obligations. Alfred's Christian understanding of kingship required rulers to act as protectors of those who lacked powerful defenders. These principles reflected more than personal compassion. Alfred recognized that stable families formed the foundation of stable communities. If widows and orphans could be robbed without consequence, confidence in the entire legal system would collapse. Property itself occupied a central place in Alfred's legislation. Most wealth in Anglo-Saxon England depended upon land. Farms produced food, supported families, and generated taxes that sustained royal government. Livestock represented valuable investments. Tools required years of skilled labor to produce. Every theft threatened survival as much as prosperity. Consequently, Alfred devoted careful attention to defining ownership and protecting property rights. Theft ranked among the most serious offenses confronting local courts. A stolen ox could deprive a farming family of the very animal needed to plow fields. The loss of sheep reduced future income from wool. Even smaller thefts undermined trust within villages where neighbors depended heavily upon one another. Yet Alfred did not believe every crime required the harshest possible punishment. Like earlier Anglo-Saxon rulers, he preferred compensation whenever circumstances allowed. An offender who stole property could often restore peace by returning what had been taken and paying additional compensation to the victim. This approach reflected practical wisdom. Executing or permanently imprisoning every thief would remove productive members from society while leaving victims uncompensated. Restitution, by contrast, repaired economic damage and reduced the likelihood of continuing conflict. Of course, not every offense could be settled so simply. Habitual criminals, violent offenders, and those who repeatedly ignored lawful judgments faced increasingly severe consequences. Alfred understood that mercy without accountability encouraged further lawlessness. Justice required balance. Compensation, known in Old English legal tradition as bot, remained one of the defining features of Anglo-Saxon law. Rather than allowing private feuds to continue indefinitely, courts sought to assign financial payments appropriate to the injury committed. These payments varied according to the nature of the offense and the social standing of those involved. Modern readers sometimes criticize these distinctions because they reflected a hierarchical society. Yet compared with endless cycles of revenge, compensation represented a remarkable step toward peaceful conflict resolution. Imagine two neighboring farming families locked in a dispute after one man's son injured another during a quarrel over grazing land. Without legal intervention, each act of retaliation might provoke another. Brothers, cousins, and future generations could become trapped in violence lasting decades. Alfred's legal philosophy sought another path. A properly conducted court could investigate the facts, determine responsibility, establish appropriate compensation, and restore peace before the conflict consumed the wider community. Justice, therefore, served not only victims and offenders, but the kingdom as a whole. The king also recognized that judges themselves determined whether law succeeded or failed. Writing excellent laws accomplished little if those responsible for enforcing them acted dishonestly. Throughout his reign, Alfred expressed concern about corrupt or incompetent officials. According to later traditions, he questioned judges personally whenever he believed they had issued unjust decisions. If a judge misunderstood the law through ignorance, Alfred expected him to study until he reached greater competence. If he knowingly accepted bribes or favored influential individuals, the offense became far more serious. One story preserved in medieval sources tells of Alfred demanding explanations from judges whose decisions appeared unfair. Whether every detail is historically accurate remains uncertain, but the tradition itself reveals how contemporaries remembered him. Alfred became known as a ruler, deeply interested in the quality of justice delivered throughout his kingdom. For him, the law could never become merely a collection of written words stored in monasteries or royal archives. It had to function in real villages, before real judges, deciding disputes that affected ordinary families. The responsibilities of royal officials therefore extended beyond collecting taxes or commanding soldiers. They became guardians of justice itself. Alfred also strengthened the king's own role in maintaining legal order. Earlier Anglo-Saxon rulers certainly issued laws, but Alfred increasingly emphasized that royal authority should ensure those laws were enforced consistently across Wessex. Local customs remained important, yet they now operated within a broader framework of royal justice. This development marked a gradual but significant shift in English government. Instead of viewing justice solely as the responsibility of local communities, Alfred presented the king as the ultimate guardian of peace throughout the realm. Crimes disturbed not merely individual victims, but the king's peace as well. Protecting public order became a central duty of the crown. Such ideas would evolve considerably over the following centuries, eventually influencing the emergence of royal courts in the English common law. Alfred did not create those later institutions directly, but he strengthened the principle that justice required active royal leadership. Religion remained inseparable from these reforms. Alfred believed that judges answered to God for every decision they rendered. Justice, therefore, demanded honesty, humility, and careful reflection. Oaths carried sacred significance because false testimony endangered both earthly society and eternal salvation. This religious foundation encouraged truthfulness in legal proceedings. Witnesses understood that lying under oath represented more than a crime against another person. It became a sin against divine authority. The king's own introduction to the Doom Book reinforced this understanding repeatedly. Human law possessed legitimacy only when grounded in moral truth. Equally striking was Alfred's moderation. Although medieval punishments could be severe by modern standards, Alfred generally avoided unnecessary cruelty. His legislation emphasized restoring order rather than displaying royal vengeance. He admired wisdom over anger, stability over fear. This moderation reflected lessons learned during years of warfare. The Viking invasions had shown Alfred what happened when violence became the normal method of settling disputes. Entire kingdoms collapsed into chaos. Communities lived in constant terror. Families fled their homes. He refused to allow similar conditions to arise through unjust government. Instead, Alfred envisioned a kingdom where people increasingly trusted courts instead of private revenge, judges instead of personal retaliation, and written law instead of uncertain memory. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Alfred's Doom Book lay not in any single legal provision, but in its method. He gathered ancient customs, respected earlier kings, embraced Christian ethics, consulted experienced advisors, and adapted inherited traditions to meet the needs of a changing world. He neither rejected the past nor became imprisoned by it. His law code therefore became a bridge. Behind it stood centuries of Anglo-Saxon custom reaching back to the earliest English kingdoms. Ahead of it lay generations of rulers who would continue expanding royal justice, refining administration, and strengthening legal institutions. Alfred himself understood that no code could anticipate every future dispute. Laws required wise interpretation and honest enforcement. New circumstances would always arise. Yet by collecting, preserving, and improving England's legal inheritance, he ensured that future kings possessed stronger foundations than he himself had inherited. His greatest reforms were only beginning. The Doom Book established principles, but those principles would prove their true worth only when tested in everyday life. When farmers disputed boundaries, merchants accused thieves, widows defended inheritances, neighbors swore oaths before local courts, and judges struggled to balance mercy with justice. In villages scattered across Wessex, far from the royal court, Alfred's vision would gradually transform the daily lives of ordinary people. There, in humble disputes over fields, livestock, contracts, and broken promises, the king's laws would begin accomplishing something no battlefield victory alone could ever achieve. They would teach a war-weary kingdom that peace was not simply the absence of enemies. Peace was the presence of justice. How Alfred's laws changed everyday life. When Alfred completed his great law code, its true importance did not lie in the carefully written words preserved by scribes. A law book hidden inside a monastery could not restore order to a kingdom. Its value depended entirely upon whether judges, reeves, priests, landowners, and ordinary villagers accepted its authority. The measure of Alfred's achievement would therefore be found not in the royal court, but in the countless disputes settled across Wessex, where everyday people sought justice instead of revenge. The transformation was gradual rather than sudden. No decree could erase generations of local custom overnight, nor could one king instantly eliminate violence from a land that had endured decades of Viking invasion. Yet Alfred's reforms slowly strengthened the idea that disputes should be resolved according to recognized legal principles instead of personal strength. Over time, this change altered the daily lives of thousands of people. One of the most common legal conflicts involved land. In 9th century England, land represented far more than wealth. It determined a family's livelihood, social standing, and future. A field provided grain to survive the winter. Meadows fed cattle that produced milk and leather. Woodland supplied timber for homes and fuel for fires. Losing even a small piece of farmland could threaten an entire household. Imagine two neighboring farmers living in Wessex shortly after Alfred's reforms. Their fathers had agreed upon the boundary between their fields years earlier, using an ancient oak tree and a narrow stream as landmarks. During the chaos of Viking raids, the oak had burned, the stream changed its course after severe flooding, and neither family could now agree where one property ended and the other began. Without trusted legal institutions, such disagreements easily became violent. Harsh words led to fistfights. Fistfights became bloodshed. Relatives joined the conflict until entire villages divided into hostile camps. Under Alfred's growing system of justice, however, another path existed. The dispute could be brought before a local assembly where respected members of the community examined evidence. Elderly neighbors might testify about the original boundary. Oaths could be sworn before God affirming honest recollection. Royal officials supervised proceedings to ensure established legal customs were followed. Rather than allowing the strongest family simply to seize the land, the court sought a judgment acceptable under the law. Not every decision satisfied everyone involved, but the existence of a recognized process reduced the temptation to settle disagreements through force. Theft investigations likewise became more structured. Livestock theft posed one of the greatest dangers facing rural communities. A stolen ox deprived its owner of the animal needed to plow fields. Missing sheep reduced future income from wool and meat. Horses represented valuable military and agricultural assets. Suppose a farmer awoke one morning to discover several cattle missing from his pasture. In earlier times, suspicion alone might provoke immediate retaliation against a neighboring family. Armed men could gather before sunrise, convinced they already knew the guilty party. Alfred's legal reforms encouraged greater caution. The owner reported the theft to local officials. Witnesses described unfamiliar travelers or suspicious activity. If stolen animals appeared in another village, questions arose concerning how they had been acquired. Possession alone did not automatically prove guilt, but it demanded explanation. Those accused possessed opportunities to defend themselves through testimony, witnesses, or sworn oaths. Although medieval investigations lacked modern forensic methods, the emphasis increasingly shifted toward lawful inquiry rather than instant revenge. Oath-taking occupied a central place in these proceedings. Modern courts rely heavily upon written documents, scientific evidence, and professional investigators. Anglo-Saxon England possessed none of these advantages. Instead, reputation carried extraordinary importance. When individuals swore an oath before God, they declared not only their innocence or honesty, but also accepted spiritual consequences if they lied. Communities believed divine judgment ultimately awaited. In difficult cases, a defendant might bring oath helpers, respected members of the community willing to swear they believed his testimony truthful. Their role did not involve claiming direct knowledge of events. Rather, they testified to the accused person's character and credibility. This system depended heavily upon reputation. A man known for honesty found it easier to gather supporters willing to stand beside him in court. Habitual troublemakers discovered that even neighbors hesitated to risk their own reputations by supporting doubtful claims. While imperfect, this practice encouraged people to value integrity throughout their daily lives. Perhaps the most profound effect of Alfred's legal philosophy appeared in its continued preference for compensation over endless blood feuds. For centuries, feuds had haunted many early medieval societies. One killing demanded another. One insult required retaliation. Families remained trapped in cycles of violence lasting generations. Alfred did not invent compensation. Earlier Anglo-Saxon kings had long recognized its importance. What he accomplished was strengthening its authority within a broader royal system of justice. Imagine two young men involved in a violent quarrel during a village gathering. One strikes the other with a farming tool, causing serious injury. The victim's brothers immediately demand vengeance. Without legal intervention, retaliation might continue indefinitely. Instead, the matter comes before local authorities. Witnesses describe the incident. The court determines responsibility. Compensation appropriate to the injury is ordered according to established law. Payment cannot erase suffering, but it offers an honorable conclusion accepted by both families. Peace, though sometimes fragile, becomes possible. This emphasis upon reconciliation proved invaluable in a kingdom recovering from decades of warfare. The church also benefited from Alfred's reforms. Monasteries and churches served many purposes beyond religious worship. They educated clergy, preserved books, cared for the poor, recorded legal transactions, and often stored valuable documents. Viking attacks had repeatedly targeted these institutions because they possessed treasures and lacked strong defenses. Alfred recognized that rebuilding Christian life required legal protection. His laws reinforced penalties for stealing church property, violating sanctuary, or attacking clergy performing legitimate duties. Such measures reflected both religious conviction and practical necessity. Churches contributed significantly to education and administration throughout Wessex. Protecting them strengthened the kingdom itself. Ordinary freemen likewise experienced gradual improvements under Alfred's government. Although Anglo-Saxon society remained hierarchical, common people increasingly enjoyed greater confidence that disputes would receive hearings according to recognized legal principles, rather than the arbitrary wishes of powerful landowners. Consider a craftsman hired to repair agricultural equipment for a local nobleman. After completing the work, he receives only part of the agreed payment. Previously, challenging an influential employer might have seemed hopeless. Under stronger royal justice, however, legal remedies became more accessible. Witnesses who observed the original agreement could testify. Community assemblies examined the facts. While wealthy nobles still possessed advantages, the existence of established procedures limited opportunities for outright abuse. Justice remained imperfect. Corruption did not disappear. Powerful families retained considerable influence. Yet Alfred's reforms steadily encouraged the belief that even kings expected legal fairness to prevail whenever possible. Royal officials known as reeves played increasingly important roles in this system. They represented the king within local communities, supervised administrative duties, collected revenues, and helped enforce judgments issued by courts. Their effectiveness varied considerably according to individual ability and honesty, but Alfred consistently emphasized that royal servants existed to uphold justice rather than exploit ordinary people. This expectation marked another important development. Government officials no longer served merely as collectors of taxes or commanders of military forces. They became guardians of legal order. Markets also grew more secure as confidence in royal authority expanded. Merchants preferred trading where contracts would be respected and theft punished consistently. Farmers transported surplus grain, livestock, and wool with greater confidence that disputes could be resolved peacefully if disagreements arose. Economic recovery therefore accompanied legal reform. Stable laws encouraged investment, reliable justice promoted trade. Prosperity gradually returned to regions devastated by years of conflict. None of these improvements occurred overnight. Many parts of England remained beyond Alfred's direct authority. Viking-controlled territories developed under different legal traditions. New invasions occasionally threatened the fragile peace. Harvest failures and disease continued affecting daily life. Nevertheless, within Wessex, something remarkable was happening. People slowly began expecting disputes to reach courts instead of battlefields. Children grew up watching elders resolve disagreements before assemblies rather than through private warfare. Communities learned that written law, supported by royal authority, could provide stability even during uncertain times. Perhaps Alfred himself best understood the significance of these quiet changes. Spectacular military victories attracted chroniclers and poets. Battles filled songs celebrating heroic kings. Yet Alfred recognized that history would ultimately judge his reign not only by enemies defeated, but by villages where neighbors lived peacefully because justice prevailed. The greatest triumph of any legal system lies in preventing conflicts before violence begins. Every land dispute settled fairly. Every theft investigated honestly. Every widow protected from unlawful seizure. Every orphan whose inheritance remained secure. Every family choosing compensation instead of revenge. These small victories rarely appeared in grand chronicles, yet together they transformed the character of Wessex. Law gradually became woven into everyday life, shaping expectations, strengthening trust, and reinforcing the authority of a kingdom that only years earlier had seemed destined to disappear. But Alfred's ambitions extended far beyond courts and legal codes. He understood that justice required more than wise laws. It demanded secure towns, effective defenses, educated officials, reliable taxation, and a government capable of protecting its people against future invasions. To preserve the peace his laws had begun creating, Alfred would next undertake one of the most comprehensive programs of military, administrative, and educational reform ever attempted by an Anglo-Saxon ruler. These reforms would not only strengthen Wessex, but also lay the foundations for the kingdom that future generations would come to know as England, building a stronger kingdom. By the late 880s, Alfred had accomplished something that few would have believed possible only a decade earlier. Wessex had survived. The Viking armies that once seemed unstoppable had been checked. His law code was strengthening the administration of justice, and communities across the kingdom were beginning to recover from years of devastation. Yet, Alfred knew that survival did not guarantee security. If Wessex simply returned to the old ways, another great invasion could undo everything he had rebuilt. Peace had to be defended not only by brave warriors, but also by strong institutions. The king, therefore, embarked upon a series of reforms unlike anything previously attempted in Anglo-Saxon England. He sought to create a kingdom that could resist invasion, govern efficiently, educate its leaders, and preserve justice even during times of crisis. Military strength, administrative organization, economic stability, and learning all became parts of a single vision. Alfred believed they depended upon one another. A kingdom could not possess good laws without capable officials. Officials required education. Education flourished only where peace existed. Peace itself depended upon effective defenses. Perhaps the most visible of Alfred's reforms was the construction and restoration of fortified towns, known in Old English as burhs. Before Alfred's reign, many settlements possessed little protection against determined attackers. Viking armies could often move swiftly through the countryside, capturing towns, seizing supplies, and retreating before local forces assembled. Alfred intended to end this vulnerability. Across Wessex, new defensive centers appeared. Some occupied former Roman towns whose ancient stone walls still stood after centuries of neglect. Others rose in entirely new locations chosen for their strategic importance. Earthworks, wooden palisades, deep ditches, and eventually stronger fortifications surrounded these settlements. The burhs were far more than military forts. Each served as a center of local government, commerce, and administration. Markets operated within their walls. Craftsmen established workshops. Royal officials maintained records. During emergencies, nearby villagers could bring their families, livestock, and valuable possessions behind the defenses, rather than abandoning everything to invading armies. The locations of these fortified towns were carefully planned. Alfred's government created a network that ensured almost every inhabitant of Wessex lived within a reasonable distance of a place of refuge. If Viking forces landed unexpectedly, warning could spread rapidly from one burh to another. Local populations no longer faced the impossible choice between defending isolated villages or fleeing into forests and marshes. The system represented a remarkable achievement in strategic planning. Each burh required labor, resources, and continuous maintenance. Defensive walls had to be repaired. Gates needed guarding. Food supplies required storage. Roads connecting fortified towns demanded improvement so troops and messengers could travel quickly between them. The burden upon local communities was considerable, yet the benefits soon became clear. When new Viking invasions occurred during the final years of Alfred's reign, enemy armies discovered that capturing territory had become significantly more difficult. Instead of finding scattered, undefended settlements, they encountered organized resistance supported by a network of strongholds capable of sustaining prolonged defense. Military reform extended beyond fortifications. Alfred also reorganized the kingdom's army. Traditional Anglo-Saxon military service relied heavily upon the fyrd, a militia composed of freemen summoned when danger threatened. While this system had served earlier generations reasonably well, prolonged Viking campaigns exposed its weaknesses. Farmers could not remain away from their fields indefinitely without risking failed harvests. Yet, if they returned home too soon, the kingdom lost its defenders. Viking armies, by contrast, often campaigned throughout the year. Alfred introduced a more flexible arrangement. Rather than calling every available fighting man into service simultaneously, he divided military obligations so that one portion of the force remained on campaign, while another returned home to cultivate crops and support their families. At regular intervals, these groups exchanged responsibilities. The seemingly simple change produced enormous advantages. The kingdom maintained a more permanent military presence without destroying its agricultural economy. Soldiers received opportunities to rest and provide for their households. Crops continued growing while defenses remained strong. The reformed fyrd became one of the foundations upon which later English military organization developed. Alfred also recognized the growing importance of naval defense. Although he is sometimes called the father of the English Navy, this title should be understood carefully. England would not possess a permanent royal navy in the modern sense for many centuries. Nevertheless, Alfred clearly appreciated that Viking power depended heavily upon ships. If enemies controlled the seas, they could choose where and when to attack. To counter this advantage, Alfred ordered the construction of larger vessels designed specifically for warfare. According to contemporary accounts, some of these ships exceeded the size of typical Viking longships and incorporated features intended to improve their fighting capabilities. Results proved mixed. Certain naval engagements ended successfully, while others exposed weaknesses in the new designs. Even so, Alfred's willingness to invest in maritime defense demonstrated remarkable strategic foresight. He understood that protecting England required attention to both land and sea. Equally significant were Alfred's administrative reforms. A kingdom recovering from decades of conflict required effective government capable of collecting taxes, organizing labor, supervising justice, and coordinating military preparations. Royal officials assumed increasingly important responsibilities throughout Wessex. The king relied upon ealdormen to govern major regions, while reeves managed local administration, oversaw royal estates, collected revenues, and ensured that laws were properly enforced. Alfred expected these officials to act honestly and competently. Their positions carried authority, but also accountability. The collection of taxes became more systematic. Medieval taxation often appears unpopular in historical records, yet Alfred understood that fortifications, armies, roads, and administration required reliable funding. Communities contributed labor toward maintaining burghs. Landowners fulfilled military obligations. Agricultural production supported both local defense and royal government. Unlike arbitrary demands imposed during emergencies, these obligations gradually became integrated into a more organized administrative system. Such reforms strengthened the kingdom's resilience. Perhaps Alfred's most extraordinary achievement, however, occurred far from battlefields and government offices. He launched an educational revival. The Viking invasions had devastated monasteries, interrupted scholarship, and reduced the number of clergy capable of reading Latin fluently. Alfred viewed this decline with deep concern. In the preface to one of his translations, he lamented that very few people south of the River Humber could understand Latin texts well enough to translate them into English. Some priests struggled even to comprehend the prayers they recited. For Alfred, this represented more than an intellectual problem. Ignorance weakened government. Judges required learning to interpret laws wisely. Clergy needed education to guide their congregations. Officials depended upon literacy to maintain records and communicate effectively. Without knowledge, justice itself suffered. The king therefore invited scholars from across Britain and continental Europe to his court. Men from Mercia, Wales, and the Frankish kingdoms joined Alfred's circle, bringing expertise in theology, grammar, history, and philosophy. Together, they undertook an ambitious program of translation. Rather than limiting important books to those fluent in Latin, Alfred ordered many influential works rendered into Old English, the language spoken by his people. Among these texts were Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, intended to guide bishops and church leaders, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Exploring Wisdom Amid Adversity, St. Augustine's Soliloquies, and the Ecclesiastical History of the Venerable Bed, which preserved the story of England's Christian past. These translations represented far more than literary achievements. They reflected Alfred's conviction that knowledge should strengthen government throughout the kingdom. He hoped that educated nobles would govern more wisely, that priests would preach more effectively, that judges would better understand justice, that future generations would inherit learning rather than ignorance. The king himself participated actively in these efforts. Despite chronic health problems that caused him pain throughout much of his adult life, Alfred devoted countless hours to study, discussion, and translation. His court became one of the most vibrant intellectual centers in Western Europe, during a period often remembered for warfare and political instability. Learning, in Alfred's view, belonged alongside courage. The ideal ruler combined military skill with wisdom. This philosophy shaped royal government itself. Written records became increasingly important. Communication between different parts of the kingdom improved. Royal authority rested not only upon personal loyalty, but also upon administrative competence. Gradually, Wessex evolved into a more centralized and effective state. These reforms produced results extending far beyond Alfred's own lifetime. The network of burghs provided secure centers from which later kings expanded their authority into neighboring territories. Improved administration enabled more consistent law enforcement. Educational revival preserved texts that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Military reorganization created forces capable of responding rapidly to future invasions. None of these achievements occurred in isolation. Each reinforced the others. Fortified towns protected schools and monasteries. Education produced capable administrators. Administrators collected resources, supporting armies. Armies defended the peace upon which justice depended. Together, they formed the foundation of a stronger kingdom. When Alfred died in 899, he left his successors something far more valuable than conquered territory. He left institutions. Kings after him would inherit fortified towns instead of vulnerable villages. They would command organized administrations instead of fragmented local authorities. They would govern people increasingly accustomed to written law, educated clergy, and stronger royal leadership. Most importantly, they would inherit a vision of kingship unlike any England had previously known. A king who defended his people not only with the sword, but also through learning, justice, and good government. That legacy would soon pass to his son, Edward the Elder, and then to future rulers who would carry Alfred's work beyond the borders of Wessex, transforming his kingdom into the beginnings of a united England. Alfred's lasting legacy. When Alfred the Great died on 26th October 899, He left behind no vast empire stretching across Europe, no dazzling palace to rival those of the Byzantine emperors, and no endless list of conquered territories. By the standards of many medieval rulers, his kingdom remained modest in size, and large portions of England were still under Scandinavian control. Yet history would remember him more favorably than kings who had ruled far greater lands. His greatest achievement was not measured by the boundaries of his realm, but by the foundations he laid for the generations that followed. The true test of any ruler lies not only in what he accomplishes during his lifetime, but in what survives after his death. Many kingdoms collapse as soon as a strong king disappears. Ambitious nobles compete for power, enemies exploit uncertainty, and years of careful reform vanish almost overnight. That did not happen in Wessex. Alfred's institutions proved stronger than the man who had created them. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited a kingdom that possessed fortified towns, reorganized military, experienced administrators, and a growing tradition of royal justice. Edward certainly faced enormous challenges. Viking rulers still controlled much of eastern and northern England, and the dream of a united English kingdom remained incomplete. Nevertheless, unlike his father in 871, Edward did not begin his reign amid total collapse. He inherited a stable government capable of supporting ambitious campaigns. Edward understood the value of Alfred's reforms because he had watched them take shape throughout his youth. Working closely with his remarkable sister, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, Edward expanded the system of burhs established by Alfred. New fortified towns appeared across territories gradually recovered from Scandinavian rule. These strongholds became centers of administration, just as Alfred had intended, allowing newly reconquered regions to be governed securely rather than merely occupied by military force. The reconquest of England therefore depended not only upon battlefield victories, but also upon the institutions Alfred had designed. Each town restored to Anglo-Saxon control entered a growing network of royal government. Each newly defended settlement strengthened trade. Each successful campaign extended the reach of laws that increasingly united diverse communities under common authority. Edward's reign demonstrated that Alfred's vision had become practical reality. The next great step came through Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan. If Alfred may rightly be called the architect of English unity, Aethelstan became the ruler who brought much of that vision into political existence. Following years of military success and careful diplomacy, Aethelstan emerged as the first king to exercise authority over nearly all of England. In 927, after securing control of Northumbria, he achieved what earlier generations had scarcely imagined possible. For the first time, one ruler governed virtually the entire English people. This remarkable accomplishment did not arise suddenly. It rested upon decades of preparation. Without Alfred's survival during the crisis of 878, Wessex itself might have disappeared. Without Alfred's administrative reforms, Edward could not have governed expanding territories efficiently. Without the network of fortified towns, reconquest would have remained far more difficult. Without the growing tradition of royal justice, political unity would have lacked institutional support. Aethelstan inherited more than territory. He inherited Alfred's state. The influence of Alfred's reforms extended even beyond his immediate descendants. King Edgar, who ruled during the second half of the 10th century, presided over one of the most peaceful and prosperous periods in Anglo-Saxon history. By Edgar's reign, the kingdom possessed increasingly sophisticated administration, stronger royal authority, and legal traditions that reached back through Edward to Alfred himself. Edgar continued issuing laws, strengthening local government, and emphasizing consistent justice throughout his realm. In doing so, he reinforced an important principle first championed so effectively by Alfred, that kings should govern through law rather than personal whim. This idea gradually transformed English kingship. Earlier Anglo-Saxon rulers certainly possessed legal authority, but Alfred elevated legislation into one of the central responsibilities of the crown. Future kings increasingly accepted that maintaining justice formed an essential part of successful government. The office of kingship itself evolved. A ruler became more than a war leader. He became the guardian of peace, the protector of legal order, the defender of the church, the patron of learning, the supreme judge responsible for ensuring fairness throughout the kingdom. These expectations did not always match reality. Some later kings governed wisely, others ruled poorly. Yet the ideal remained. That ideal owed much to Alfred. His influence upon Anglo-Saxon government reached into countless aspects of administration. Royal officials exercised greater responsibility in enforcing law. Written documents assumed increasing importance in recording grants, agreements, and judgments. Regional government became more closely connected to the authority of the crown. Fortified towns functioned as administrative centers as well as military defenses. Even taxation grew more systematic, providing resources necessary for maintaining both justice and security. None of these developments emerged fully formed during Alfred's reign. Rather, he established patterns that later rulers expanded and refined. Historians often describe Alfred's government as a bridge between earlier tribal kingship and the more centralized monarchy that eventually emerged in medieval England. Perhaps nowhere is Alfred's legacy more significant than in the history of English law. His Doom Book preserved valuable legal traditions that might otherwise have disappeared during years of warfare and political upheaval. By collecting earlier laws, revising them carefully, and presenting them within a Christian moral framework, Alfred ensured continuity across generations. Future rulers repeatedly issued new legal codes. Edward the Elder added further legislation. King Edmund addressed problems of public order and violence. King Edgar strengthened administrative justice. King Nut, despite being a Danish conqueror, respected many existing Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, rather than replacing them entirely. This remarkable continuity distinguished England from many other medieval kingdoms where repeated invasions often swept away earlier institutions. Instead of beginning anew after each political crisis, English rulers increasingly built upon inherited foundations. Alfred played a crucial role in preserving those foundations. Although historians rightly caution against tracing direct, uninterrupted lines from Alfred to every later legal development, his influence upon the growth of English law remains unmistakable. His emphasis on written legislation encouraged future kings to issue their own legal reforms. His concern for impartial judgment strengthened expectations regarding royal responsibility. His combination of ancient custom with thoughtful adaptation demonstrated how law could evolve without abandoning tradition. Most importantly, Alfred reinforced the idea that justice should extend throughout the kingdom under royal protection. This principle gradually expanded over succeeding centuries. Royal courts acquired greater authority. Judges developed more consistent procedures. Legal precedents accumulated. Communities increasingly expected disputes to be resolved through established institutions rather than private violence. Centuries later, these developments would contribute to what became known as the English common law. Alfred did not create the common law itself. That sophisticated legal system emerged gradually through the work of many generations, particularly after the Norman conquest. Yet Alfred helped establish one of its earliest and most enduring assumptions, that the king bore ultimate responsibility for maintaining justice across the realm. His educational reforms likewise produced lasting consequences. By encouraging the translation of important works into Old English, Alfred preserved knowledge during a period when much of Western Europe struggled with declining literacy. The books translated under his patronage influenced generations of clergy, scholars, and administrators. His commitment to learning inspired later monastic revivals that enriched English intellectual life. The very idea that rulers should promote education became part of his enduring reputation. Perhaps equally important was Alfred's example. Later, medieval writers admired him not simply because he defeated Viking armies, but because he embodied qualities they considered ideal in a Christian king. He sought wisdom before acting. He consulted advisors, rather than relying solely upon personal opinion. He respected inherited traditions while recognizing the need for reform. He combined military courage with intellectual curiosity. He pursued justice without abandoning mercy. These characteristics shaped his memory for centuries. Chroniclers praised him. Churchmen celebrated him. Legal scholars looked back upon his legislation with admiration. Even after the Norman conquest transformed England in 1066, Alfred's reputation survived. The new rulers recognized him as one of the greatest kings in the island's history. His name appeared repeatedly in historical writings, legal discussions, and royal propaganda. Generations remembered him as the ruler who had preserved England during its darkest hour. Yet perhaps Alfred's greatest legacy cannot be measured through laws, battles, or institutions alone. He changed how people imagined the purpose of government. In an age when kingdoms often depended upon personal loyalty and military strength, Alfred argued that rulers carried deeper obligations. They must educate. They must judge fairly. They must preserve peace. They must protect the weak. They must strengthen institutions capable of surviving individual reigns. These ideas outlived him. Long after Alfred's own kingdom had evolved into something larger than he could have imagined, English rulers continued building upon principles he had helped establish. The England that emerged over the following centuries owed much to countless kings, queens, judges, bishops, soldiers, and ordinary people. Yet, standing near the beginning of that long story was Alfred of Wessex, a king who had refused to believe that survival alone was enough. He believed a kingdom deserved justice. He believed justice required law, and he believed law, wisely governed, possessed the power to unite a divided people into a nation. From Alfred's Law Code to Magna Carta. When Alfred the Great assembled his Doom Book in the late 9th century, he could not possibly have foreseen the legal world that would emerge 300 years later. He did not know that Norman knights would one day conquer England, that royal judges would travel the kingdom hearing cases, or that rebellious barons would force a king to accept limitations on his own authority at a meadow called Runnymede. Yet the principles Alfred championed, The value of written law, the responsibility of rulers to administer justice, and the belief that peace depended upon fair legal institutions would echo throughout the centuries that followed. The history of English law was never the work of a single individual. It evolved slowly, shaped by conquest, political change, religious influence, economic growth, and countless practical decisions made by kings, judges, churchmen, and local communities. Alfred did not create the finished system. Instead, he helped preserve one of its earliest foundations at a moment when England itself seemed in danger of disappearing. After Alfred's death, his successors continued issuing royal law codes. Edward the Elder expanded his father's authority into lands reclaimed from Viking rule. King Ethelstan introduced new legislation dealing with trade, theft, coinage, and public order, reflecting the needs of an increasingly unified kingdom. Edmund the Sir strengthened measures against violence and attempted to reduce the destructive cycle of blood feuds. Edgar the Peaceful reorganized local administration and reinforced the authority of royal justice. Each generation inherited Alfred's example. Rather than ruling solely through personal command, English kings increasingly governed through written legislation. Laws evolved as society changed, but the expectation that rulers should publish legal judgments remained firmly established. The local institutions that Alfred had strengthened also continued developing. Shire courts met regularly to settle disputes involving land, inheritance, contracts, and criminal offenses. Hundred courts handled smaller matters closer to individual communities. Local reeves supervised administration, while royal officials gradually increased the crown's influence over legal proceedings. Although justice still depended heavily upon local participation, royal authority became steadily more visible. The king's peace expanded. Originally, the king's peace applied mainly to his household, his officials, and certain protected locations. Over time, however, English rulers claimed responsibility for maintaining order throughout larger portions of the kingdom. Crimes increasingly came to be viewed not only as offenses against individual victims, but also as violations of public peace under royal protection. This shift represented one of the most important developments in medieval government. The law gradually became less personal and more institutional. That evolution was interrupted, but not destroyed, by one of the greatest turning points in English history. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest transformed England politically, socially, and culturally. A new aristocracy replaced much of the old Anglo-Saxon nobility. French became the language of the royal court. Castles appeared across the landscape. Land ownership underwent sweeping redistribution. At first glance, it might seem that Alfred's legal legacy disappeared beneath Norman rule. In reality, the situation proved far more complex. William the Conqueror understood that stable government required continuity as well as change. While he introduced Norman institutions, he also preserved many existing Anglo-Saxon practices that had functioned effectively. Local courts continued operating. The administrative divisions known as shires remained. Many officials retained familiar responsibilities. The Domesday Book of 1086, one of the greatest administrative surveys of the Middle Ages, reflected the same determination to organize government through careful record-keeping that Alfred himself would have admired. Norman rulers brought new ideas, but they built upon foundations that already existed. One of William's sons, Henry the Firm, demonstrated this continuity particularly clearly. When Henry claimed the throne in 1100, he issued a document known as the Charter of Liberties. This charter promised to correct abuses that had occurred during the previous reign and pledged to govern according to established customs rather than arbitrary oppression. Although the Charter of Liberties did not create constitutional government, it introduced an important principle. Even kings publicly acknowledged obligations. Royal authority carried responsibilities. Promises concerning justice could be expressed in written form. This concept echoed Alfred's own belief that rulers governed under law rather than above it. The greatest transformation in English law during the 12th century came under Henry II. Ascending the throne in 1154, Henry inherited a kingdom weakened by years of civil conflict. Like Alfred, centuries earlier, he recognized that restoring order required stronger legal institutions. Henry's reforms permanently changed the administration of justice. Instead of relying almost entirely upon local courts, he expanded the authority of royal judges who traveled throughout England hearing disputes on behalf of the crown. These itinerant justices carried royal justice into every region of the kingdom. As they decided cases, patterns began emerging. Judges increasingly considered previous decisions when resolving similar disputes. Gradually, a body of shared legal practice developed across England. Historians later called this the common law because it applied commonly throughout the realm rather than varying dramatically between local jurisdictions. Henry II also strengthened the use of juries. Earlier Anglo-Saxon communities had relied upon local testimony and sworn oaths. Henry adapted and expanded these traditions, using groups of local men to present evidence and identify facts in legal proceedings. The system evolved slowly, but its roots reached back into much older practices of communal participation in justice. Royal courts became increasingly professional. Written records multiplied. Legal procedures grew more consistent. These developments represented enormous advances in administrative government. Yet they also raised difficult questions. If kings possessed growing judicial authority, who protected subjects against unjust kings? That question came dramatically to the forefront during the reign of King John. By the early 13th century, John's heavy taxation, military failures, arbitrary decisions, and conflicts with powerful nobles produced widespread dissatisfaction. In 1215, rebellious barons compelled the king to negotiate at Runnymede beside the River Thames. The resulting agreement became known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Few medieval documents have acquired greater historical significance. Its immediate purpose was practical rather than revolutionary. The barons sought protection for their own rights and limitations upon specific royal abuses. Nevertheless, Magna Carta expressed ideas whose influence extended far beyond its original circumstances. Among its most famous provisions declared that no free man should be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or punished, except through the lawful judgment of his equals, or according to the law of the land. Another clause promised that justice would neither be sold, delayed, nor denied. These statements did not establish modern democracy. They did not create equal rights for every inhabitant of England. Most people living in 1215 possessed no direct political voice. Yet Magna Carta affirmed something profoundly important. Even the king must respect the law. Royal power had limits. Justice required established procedures rather than arbitrary commands. These principles resonated across subsequent centuries. The charter was reissued several times by later monarchs. Lawyers studied it, parliamentarians invoked it, judges cited it, political reformers celebrated it. Eventually, Magna Carta came to symbolize the broader idea that government itself should remain accountable to law. The road from Alfred's doom book to Magna Carta was neither straight nor uninterrupted. Between them lay Viking invasions, royal successions, the Norman conquest, civil wars, religious change, administrative reform, and countless local disputes settled in village courts. Many individuals contributed to this long evolution. Alfred, Edward, Ethelstan, Edgar, William the Conqueror, Henry I, Henry II, John, and many others each shaped English legal history according to the needs of their own age. No single ruler deserves sole credit. Yet Alfred occupies a unique place near the beginning of that story. When England stood on the brink of destruction, he preserved earlier legal traditions instead of allowing them to vanish. He demonstrated that written law strengthened royal government. He insisted that justice formed one of a king's highest responsibilities. He connected legal authority with moral obligation. He encouraged future generations to improve inherited institutions rather than abandon them. Historians therefore regard Alfred not as the creator of the English legal system in its final form, but as one of its earliest and most influential architects. The rule of law, a principle often summarized by the idea that laws should govern rulers as well as subjects, did not suddenly appear in Alfred's lifetime, nor was it fully established by Magna Carta. Instead, it emerged gradually through centuries of experience, reform, conflict, and compromise. Alfred's contribution lay in ensuring that one of the darkest periods in English history became not the end of lawful government, but the beginning of its renewal. His laws helped preserve the belief that justice should be written, remembered, taught, and enforced. That belief survived conquest. It survived dynastic change. It survived political upheaval. And as generations continued refining England's legal tradition, the memory of the scholar king from Wessex remained woven into its earliest foundations. From the smoke-filled villages of the Viking Age to the signing of Magna Carta more than 3 centuries later, one enduring lesson connected every stage of the journey. Kingdoms could be won by the sword, but they could only endure when law became stronger than power itself. Why Alfred the Great still matters. Today, more than 11 centuries have passed since Alfred the Great died, yet his name continues to occupy a unique place in English history. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Dynasties have disappeared. Empires have been built and lost. Countless monarchs have worn the English crown. Yet among them all, only one native English king has permanently retained the title the Great. That distinction was not awarded by Alfred himself, nor was it the result of a single military triumph. It reflected the extraordinary breadth of his achievements and the enduring influence of his vision. Many rulers have been remembered as brilliant generals. Others have earned praise as wise lawmakers or generous patrons of learning. Alfred combined all of these qualities in a single reign during one of the darkest periods England had ever faced. He first proved himself as a warrior. When Alfred became king in 871, the future of Wessex, and perhaps of Anglo-Saxon England itself, appeared hopeless. Viking armies had already destroyed Northumbria. East Anglia, and much of Mercia. The great heathen army had demonstrated remarkable military skill, relentless determination, and an ability to exploit political divisions among the English kingdoms. Many contemporaries believed complete conquest was inevitable. Alfred refused to accept that fate. His darkest moment came in the winter of 878, when he fled into the marshes of Somerset after Guthrum's surprise attack on Chippenham. Few kings in history have come closer to losing everything. Reduced to a small band of loyal followers, separated from much of his kingdom, and surrounded by uncertainty, Alfred could easily have disappeared into history as the last ruler of a defeated people. Instead, he rebuilt. From the marshes of Athelney, he gathered allies, restored confidence among his followers, and carefully planned the campaign that culminated in the decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. That triumph secured the survival of Wessex and prevented the complete Viking conquest of southern England. Yet Alfred himself understood that military success alone could never guarantee the future. Winning a battle could preserve a kingdom for a season. Building institutions could preserve it for generations. It was here that Alfred's greatness became truly exceptional. Rather than spending the remainder of his reign celebrating victory, he turned immediately to the more difficult work of reconstruction. He reorganized the army, built fortified burhs across Wessex, strengthened administration, improved taxation, expanded education, encouraged literacy, translated important works into Old English, and established one of medieval England's most influential collections of laws. These reforms reflected a remarkably modern understanding of leadership. Alfred recognized that security depended upon more than soldiers. Strong governments required educated officials. Justice demanded honest judges. Economic prosperity relied upon peace. Peace itself rested upon public confidence that laws would be applied fairly. Every reform supported the others. Military organization protected towns. Towns encouraged trade. Trade strengthened the economy. Education produced capable administrators. Administration enforced justice. Justice united the kingdom. This integrated vision distinguished Alfred from many of his contemporaries. He was also a scholar. In an age when literacy remained rare, Alfred believed knowledge represented one of the greatest defenses against decline. He lamented the loss of learning, caused by decades of warfare, and worked tirelessly to reverse it. By inviting scholars to his court and translating major Latin works into Old English, he ensured that wisdom became accessible to people who could not read the language of the church. His translations were never merely academic exercises, they served practical purposes. Kings needed history to govern wisely. Judges required moral guidance. Clergy depended upon theological learning. Officials benefited from philosophy and ethical instruction. For Alfred, education strengthened every part of society. His commitment to learning inspired later generations and preserved valuable texts that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Yet perhaps Alfred's most enduring contribution lay in his understanding of justice. The Doom Book represented far more than a legal handbook. It expressed a philosophy of government. Alfred believed that rulers possessed moral responsibilities extending beyond military command. Kings should protect widows and orphans. They should defend property rights. They should appoint honest judges. They should encourage peaceful settlements rather than endless revenge. Above all, they should govern according to principles rooted in justice rather than arbitrary power. Modern legal systems differ enormously from those of the 9th century. Trial by jury, professional lawyers, independent courts, written constitutions, and parliamentary government all developed centuries after Alfred's death. It would therefore be inaccurate to claim that Alfred directly created modern democracy, or the English common law in its mature form. History is rarely so simple. Legal institutions evolve gradually through the contributions of many generations. Nevertheless, historians continue to recognize Alfred as one of the earliest rulers to strengthen the idea that good government required consistent law administered throughout the kingdom. His reforms helped preserve legal continuity during a period when invasion threatened to destroy existing institutions altogether. That continuity mattered. Later kings expanded royal justice. Norman rulers adapted earlier Anglo-Saxon administration. Henry II transformed judicial organization. Magna Carta reinforced the principle that rulers themselves must respect the law. Each generation added something new. Each inherited something from those who came before. Among those early foundations, Alfred's work remains unmistakable. His influence extends beyond legal history into the broader development of English government itself. The fortified towns he established became centers of administration for future rulers. His educational reforms encouraged literacy among clergy and officials. His administrative organization strengthened royal authority. His military innovations enabled later kings to defend expanding territories. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred demonstrated that effective government required preparation rather than reaction. He did not simply respond to crises. He built institutions capable of surviving them. This lesson remains relevant today. Modern societies continue facing challenges that cannot be solved by temporary victories alone. Economic uncertainty, political instability, international conflict, natural disasters, and social division all require durable institutions supported by public trust. Alfred understood this more than 1,000 years ago. Leadership meant preparing the future, not merely surviving the present. Historians, therefore, continue studying Alfred not because every decision he made was perfect, but because he exemplified a rare combination of qualities. He possessed courage without recklessness, learning without arrogance, religious conviction without abandoning practical judgment, authority tempered by responsibility, vision balanced by respect for tradition. These characteristics allowed him to preserve what was valuable while reforming what no longer served the needs of his kingdom. His reputation has endured because it rests upon substance rather than legend. Stories such as the famous burnt cakes may or may not contain historical truth, but they have never formed the basis of Alfred's greatness. His true achievements require no embellishment. He defended the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom when defeat seemed certain. He reorganized its military. He strengthened its government. He revived education. He preserved learning. He promoted justice. He inspired successors who eventually united England. Few rulers have influenced so many different aspects of national development. Standing today among the quiet fields of Wantage where Alfred was born, the marshes of Athelney where he found refuge, or the landscapes around Edington where he secured victory, it is difficult to imagine the uncertainty that once gripped 9th century England. The peaceful countryside offers little hint of the violence that threatened to erase an entire civilization. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape lies the legacy of a king who refused to surrender to despair. Alfred understood that civilizations are not preserved by armies alone. They endure because people believe in justice. They flourish because knowledge is valued. They survive because governments earn trust through fairness rather than fear. His greatest victory was never simply the defeat of Guthrum's army or the survival of Wessex. Those triumphs, remarkable though they were, belonged to a single generation. His true victory reached far beyond his own lifetime. By preserving learning when ignorance spread, by strengthening justice when violence threatened to prevail, and by building institutions capable of outliving the ruler who created them, Alfred laid some of the earliest foundations upon which the Kingdom of England would eventually stand. The road from Alfred's Doom Book to Magna Carta, from medieval royal courts to the English common law, and from a divided collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to a united nation was long and often uncertain. Many remarkable men and women shaped that journey. No single ruler accomplished it alone. But when historians search for the moment at which England first began to imagine itself as a kingdom, held together not only by force of arms but also by the rule of law, the name of Alfred the Great inevitably stands near the beginning of the story. His enemies remembered him as a formidable commander. His contemporaries admired him as a wise king. Later generations honored him as a scholar and reformer. History remembers him as all of these. For in the end, Alfred's greatest achievement was not merely saving England from conquest. It was helping create an England where, little by little, law became stronger than fear, justice became stronger than vengeance, and the written word proved capable of outlasting the sword.